Tweet @TodaySOR.
The Nevin Economic Research Institute has said today that the case for cutting taxes in the next budget is very weak. Meanwhile, another think tank, the Hibernia Forum, has taken issue with the government's policy of devoting 2/3 of the fiscal space, as it's called, in the budget to spending increases and just 1/3 to tax cuts. Hibernia Forum, which adopts a right-of-centre approach, says we should favour tax cuts over spending in the budget. The man who penned the economic analysis for the Hibernia Forum, Cormac Lucy, joins me in studio. On the line from City Centre Studio is Richard Boyd Barrett of AAA People Before Profit, TD for Dunleary. Good morning to you both. First of all, Cormac Lucy, you're advocating tax cuts ahead of spending increases in the budget in just 2 weeks from now. Why?
Well, I think the key reason is if we look at the adjustments that actually took place during austerity, it was announced that roughly 2/3 of them were made up of spending cuts. But they were based on budget day announcements. If you actually look at what truly happened based on budgetary outturns, there was a consistent pattern of spending being ahead of budget and tax revenues being ahead of budget. So essentially, we estimate 2/3 of the actual budgetary adjustment occurred as a result of tax increases. And we're saying that now that the corner has been turned, if there is to be budgetary relaxation, it should broadly follow those proportions.
So what the government said and what the government did were two different things now. And how did the outturn, as you have analysed it, compare with, say, promises we would have been made? I suppose you'd have to go back, I think, as you have done, to the election of 2011.
Well, if you look at the Labour Party in 2011, they were the ones advocating the biggest adjustment through tax increases, and they said 42% of the budgetary adjustments should come that way. The government figures suggest 41% was what actually happened. But if you dig through the minutiae of the figures, especially comparing what actually happened compared to what was announced, we estimate 66% of the total budgetary adjustment came through increases in taxes and tax revenues.
I'll come to Richard Boyd Barrett in a moment, but where then do you think the benefits should go if your formula is followed for flipping that commitment as between tax cuts and spending increases?
It should happen to income taxpayers. If you look at all of the tax headings of the government, tax revenues under corporation tax, VAT, excise, they're running at or below 2007 levels. Tax revenues from income tax and USC are running at 140% of 2007 levels. So the real story of Irish budgetary adjustment has been that income taxpayers were the ones who bore the lion's share of the adjustment, and we think they should get the lion's share of any free room now available.
And I doubt it would, but just in case, might it possibly be explained by a great increase in the labour force?
There has been somewhat of an increase in the labour force, but total numbers employed are just up slightly on where they were in 2007. And corporation tax is not up above 2007. So you'd expect that with all of the talk about Apple, all of the talk of unexpectedly high corporation tax proceeds last year. Really the big story is income tax and USC increases. That's where the relief should go.
Richard Boyd Barrett, what would you say to that proposal?
Well, you see, for me, it's about who we tax. And for what purposes, rather than just this we, that is often referred to. You see, I'm not sure who the we is, and I want to make a sharp distinction, a little bit like Liam Doran was making in your earlier piece, between the low and middle income workers who have been absolutely hammered with USC, with property tax, with water charges, with all sorts of stealth taxes. They certainly need relief in terms of the USC and those austerity taxes. But I am absolutely against giving tax breaks to the higher earners, as I believe the government are now suggesting. And it's not clear to me from what Cormac is saying, although I can probably guess, does he believe that the very high earners deserve tax breaks? Because I certainly don't. And in fact, I think the tax relief that low and middle income workers need, that the nurses we've talked about and other low paid workers need, should be paid for by actually increasing taxes on wealth and capital. And crucially, we need, I think, as a more sort of strategic shift in our whole policy in this country, we will be arguing in the context of this budgetary process, we need to break from the tax haven model, which was revealed very starkly in Apple, but in fact, Apple is really just the tip of a very, very big iceberg, where the corporations in this country, for many...
Yeah, but look, can we just confine this to income tax? Because...
Well, yeah, but the point is, Sean, we have chronically low levels of investment in services and infrastructure. And this economy is not sustainable unless we begin to ramp up the levels of investment in infrastructure in the economy. And you have to be able to pay for that some way, and the only way to pay for that is for the corporations to make a fair and substantial contribution to the exchequer in this country.
Cormac Lucy?
Well, I disagree profoundly with Richard's comment, as he might have guessed, about the balance of benefits from low and middle income earners relative to high earners. The Irish Tax Institute did a very valuable report last week, and they compared somebody on 35,000 income to somebody on 18,000 income. They're earning roughly twice as much. They're paying 11 times more in income tax. So we have a system which is astonishingly progressive in terms of higher earners pay dramatically a higher share of tax than lower earners. And the Tax Institute reckon we have the most progressive system in the EU. And I think we are at risk of overtaxing high earners, discouraging the return of highly capable high earners back to Ireland. And Richard made the point that the tax competition model may be over. And I think it is certainly at risk in terms of attracting corporations to Ireland. That makes it all the more necessary that we sponsor individuals in Ireland, and we won't do that if we tax them away through high income tax rates.
Richard?
No, you see, I think at least Cormac is acknowledging that the tax haven model we have to move away from that. And I should say that in terms of the government, there's no real sign that they're going to do that. But I think that's an urgent matter now. I mean, essentially with the pressure from Europe, with the sort of anger of the public against inequality and the sort of tax double standards that we have, this tax haven model has to be broken from. But in terms of low and middle income workers, I'm sorry, I just think Cormac is not living in the real world.
There's another idea floating around. Now, maybe it's just a piece of kite flying, but it's reported in the Irish Independent today, Richard Boyd Barrett, and I was touching on this with Liam Doran earlier on, just before 11, about this idea that some specialised or highly skilled immigrants be given a special tax deal for a limited period, offering them a 30% tax rate, be they entrepreneurs or people with specialist skills in medicine, science, IT and finance. What would you say to that?
You see, behind that is this sort of prejudice that it's the so-called wealth creators, at the top, who will drive the economy forward. And I just don't buy that narrative. And that is the narrative that has justified, if you like, low taxes on wealth and on the corporations for the last number of years. If I just, you see, what Liam Doran said absolutely correctly is we need nurses, we need young professionals who are middle income earners to get a tax break and indeed to have their wages increased, as a lot of workers are out there fighting at the moment for pay restoration. That's where the tax breaks and the pay increases need to come in order that young people have a future in this country and can afford basic things like a roof over their head, which currently they can't. And
well, unusually, I would agree with Richard on this point. Another point made by the Tax Institute in last week's report was that we now have a tax system with 53 different moving parts, 3 different tax charges, income tax, USC, PRSI, each with a different entry point, and a total of 10 rates, 15 bands and 22 personal tax credits. And we have a system that is already overly complicated, unwieldy, impossible to understand, and the government's now proposing adding on another layer of complexity. It may be good, well-intentioned, but it's just making the whole system more and more difficult to manage.
What do you think of this idea of incentivising people to come home with a lower tax rate for a period?
Fair enough for 2 or 3 years, but I'd rather have a low tax system that we can all understand and that has as few special features as possible.
Richard Boyd Barrett, when you say Cormac Lucy isn't living in the real world, what do you mean?
I mean, you see, unless when he talks about a progressive tax system, he needs to recognise the fact that low and middle income workers at the moment, including people with third level education qualifications, cannot afford to live, particularly in the big urban centres, right? So that's That's not very progressive as far as I'm concerned. And that's because of chronically low levels of pay, and it's also because of a combination of very regressive austerity taxes on direct income, but also indirect taxes like property and home taxes.
And our housing market is dysfunctional.
Absolutely, and that's the other thing we need to stress. You see, it's not just about tax and pay, and this is where I agree with people like the Nevin Institute. We need major investment in childcare. We need major investment in infrastructure, particularly housing, but also in education, in a whole range of areas. And if we simply operate within this 1 billion or 1.5 billion fiscal space, we will not have the money for these things. So we need to have a much more bold and ambitious approach to the budget of getting extra revenues to invest in key areas like childcare, like housing, like education, other key areas of infrastructure. And that means we have to make the corporations and the very wealthy in Irish society pay a fair contribution in tax, which the corporations most certainly have not been. Unless we grasp that nettle, we are not going to have a sustainable economic model into the future.
There's one difficulty with what you say, Richard, about increasing public spending to increase services. We did that a decade ago. Back in the boom, public spending was growing at an annual rate of 10 to 15% per annum. And people like you, people like Father Sean Healy, that didn't satisfy you. You were still saying we need yet more spending on public services. And public services, we need them, but we can't just devote our entire economic strength to servicing them, because it is a bottomless, infinite demand situation, and we will never get to where you want us to get to.
Well, Cormac, if I could just state the obvious, it was not public investment, in my opinion, or public spending that caused the 2007 crash. I mean, how this narrative is trotted out is just stuns me, because in fact it was because the banks and developers went absolutely crazy, driven by greed for profit. That's what crashed the economy, not the levels of public expenditure.
But was it not the case, Richard Boyd Barrett, that a lot of that extra spending was paid for by taxes which were not sustainable on the back of the building boom?
Now, that's a serious point, okay? Is how do we have a sort of sustainable tax base? And this will inevitably bring us back to the sacred cow of the corporation tax rate. And you see, this is not just, by the way, a problem for Ireland.
What would you have that set at now?
Well, for a start, we have to close off the loopholes, okay? That's the nominal. We are for raising the nominal rate, but to be honest, the big leakage from the corporate tax heading is in the loopholes. We've seen it with the Section 1110, we've seen it with Apple, and we would estimate that we are probably losing about possibly as much as €8 billion a year in tax loopholes that are being exploited largely by the big multinationals. And by the way, that is at the expense of developing the small and medium indigenous enterprise that could actually give us a sustainable economic model for the future.
Well, Richard says I'm not living in reality. The reality is that the most successful use of Irish national sovereignty since 1916 was the low tax model to attract multinationals. A generation ago...
Yeah, but we're not collecting it. That's one of his big points as well.
Well, we can collect a bit more, and we probably will have to as a result of the Apple decision. But a generation ago, Belfast was a much more prosperous city than Dublin. Today, Dublin and Cork are much more prosperous cities than Belfast. It is down to our success using low taxes to attract large multinationals. We now need to use income taxes to do the same thing to attract highly capable individuals and keep those that are here.
OK, we leave it there for now. Cormac Lucy of Hibernia Forum, Richard Boyd Barrett of AAA, People Before Profit. Thank you both. We'll be talking about a variation on this theme. One of the impacts being made, or that resulted from the crash, was